The Norfolk and Western Railway in Virginia was the last major railroad in the USA to abandon steam. Apart from a few engines kept in a museum, the entire steam fleet was sent for scrap in just 2 years, between 1958 and 1960. But one scrap dealer was too sentimental to cut them up, and 3 old 480s of 1910 vintage could still be found in a Roanoke scrapyard in 1987, having lain there for 27 years after the diesel takeover. Today, you would have to be over 40 to remember steam on the railways, and while these rusty hulks may serve as a poignant reminder to the older generation, they mean little to younger folk. In the decade following the end of American steam, most people could only sample live steam on the narrow gauge, and that would mean a trip to Durango in Colorado. Or you could settle for your steam gift-wrapped, American apple pie in a leisure theme park. Steam operations on private standard gauge short lines began to appear mainly in the east. But steam on the main line was almost unknown at that time. Most companies had abandoned it too recently to contemplate its return in any form. The Norfolk and Western's neighbour, the Southern Railway, was one of the first mainline companies to see the potential of steam excursions. By 1970, they were operating a pair of ex-Southern 280s, restored to their home rails after years of service at a Tennessee coal mine. Small engines like this were not too costly to restore, but the return of the legendary giants seemed an impossible dream. But times change. Nobody would have believed that by 1987, the Norfolk and Western would have 2 of their finest locomotives back in steam. The first breakthrough came in 1982, when Robert Claytor, the chairman of the newly amalgamated Norfolk and Southern, noted for his steam sympathies, ordered the J-Class 484 passenger engine to be sent to Birmingham for overhaul. These were the last of the great American streamliners. 611 was built as late as 1950. The success of 611's return prompted the next move, the seemingly impossible. In 1987, at an estimated cost of $2 million, the mighty A-Class 2664 Mallet Articulated was returned to service. Weighing in at 425 tons, with a tractive effort of 114,000 pounds, she is now the most powerful locomotive in steam anywhere in the world. Designed in 1936, most were built during the war, the final batch appearing in 1950. There were 43 of them altogether. First on the scene at Schaefer's Crossing Yard at Roanoke was veteran photographer Winston Link, famous for his documentation of Norfolk and Western steam in the 50s. He was reliving the unique atmosphere of American superpower on shed as the mighty 1218 arrived for its first public trip in 28 years on April 25th, 1987. Preparations had started a week before, with the success of the restoration depending on the quality of the mechanical work. The maintenance team carried out frequent checks on the motion and valve gear of the 1218 during the locomotive's 3-day trip from Birmingham to Roanoke. For this running-in turn, the train consisted of only 5 coaches, a featherweight load for the 1218, due to haul over 21 coaches in the coming weekend. Steam is a rarity here, and the arrival of the big Mallet brought out half the town from both sides of the tracks. In the old days, engines like this were virtually unknown on the Southern, so the big articulated was a source of wonder even to those old enough to remember steam. Rejoining the Norfolk and Western Main Line, she was back on home ground now in the famous Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Roanoke is 1218's hometown, where she was built in 1943 in the Norfolk and Western's own shops. The town is the hub of the Norfolk and Western system, with lines radiating northwards up the Shenandoah Valley, westwards into the coal fields of West Virginia, and eastwards to the port of Norfolk, where coal is shipped for export. This involves a switchback haul of nearly 400 miles across 3 natural obstacles, the Alleghenies, the Appalachians, and the Blue Ridge, and this was the reason for building the massively powerful A-class articulateds. An up-to-date diesel servicing facility has now replaced the old steam roundhouse, but out in the yard at Schaefer's Crossing, the ghost of steam had returned, in the shape of number 1218, waiting in the night for its next turn of duty, just as though it had never left. For its inaugural public trip to Bluefield on April the 25th, conditions were not exactly perfect. Heavy rains, the worst in several years, had swollen the rivers dangerously the day before, and freight service on the main line was held up for many hours. Storm drains could hardly cope with the rush of muddy water charging down the sides of the New River Valley, and in several places it looked as though the floodwaters might wash away the track. Fortunately, the authorities had faith in the high standard of their track maintenance and decided to go ahead with the trip, though there must have been some misgivings at headquarters. The day dawned in an unremitting downpour as determined enthusiasts gathered at the Roanoke station. Whatever the weather, it was after all the first time in 28 years that a big Malay had hauled a public train. But conditions up the line had not improved much. Roads were still flooded, blocked in places by mudslides, and people living near the railway were stranded in their homes. Among them was retired coal miner Terry Todd, living by the track at Ingleside. All those years ago, the coal he mined was carried to the sea by 1218 and her sisters, and the big Malay steaming past his front porch saluted him accordingly. At Bluefield, West Virginia, the enthusiasts gathered, with the ladies taking as much interest as the men, trying out their souvenir hats. The 1218's tour terminated here, and after posing for the cameras, she was off to the yard for servicing. Bluefield is the major divisional point on the Norfolk and Western, where eastbound coal traffic is marshalled for the 400-mile haul through the Appalachians to the coast. Still dominating the yard, the disused locomotive coaling tower. Before returning to Roanoke, the 1218 had to be turned. The original turntable having long since been removed, the engine had to turn on a small triangle, or Y, normally used just for turning cabooses. "425 tons of locomotive and tender was literally stretching things. The articulated giant practically tore the spikes out of the cross ties as she crept round the tight curve, demonstrating to the full the sideways displacement of the articulated front unit. The delays caused by bad weather meant that 1218's return trip to Roanoke was made in darkness, but happily the next day dawned bright and clear for 1218's excursion over the Blue Ridge Mountains to Lynchburg. A stately exit from Roanoke in the morning sun belied the potential of this versatile engine. She's not just powerful, but fast. Despite the drama of 1218's triumphant dash up the Blue Ridge, it was still business as usual along the line, as the Norfolk Southern's flying horse symbol was borne westwards with coal empties by a pair of modern diesels. Taking no chances, the company sent a scout car to check out the line before 1218's return trip from Lynchburg to Roanoke. Then the A climbed at 1 in 80 up the Christiansburg Mountain with an afternoon trip to Walton. The climb continued through the twin tunnels at Montgomery, where the engineer reduced power to cut down the fumes in the narrow bore. A few miles west of Christiansburg, at Vicar, another of the coaling towers from steam days still survives, contrasting oddly with modern diesels. The tower symbolizes the efficiency of Norfolk and Western steam in the old days. There was an extra pair of tracks under the tower, hence the large space left there now. Here, steam trains would stop for servicing. While water was taken, coal was dropped straight into the tender from the chute above. There were no time-wasting trips to the yard, since the engine remained coupled to its train and was soon on its way again. Right on time at 5:30 p.m, the A returned to Roanoke, concluding the first of many weekends of excursion service. Veteran engineer Frank Collins gently eased the A back into its stall where once the roundhouse had been. Its removal has at least let the sunlight in to study again the detail of the engine's motion. 1218 was now firmly established as the front runner in the Norfolk and Western's excursion program. For the rest of spring and early summer 1987, 1218 toured most of the Norfolk Southern system, returning to Roanoke for the National Railway Historical Society annual convention at the end of July. One of the finest railfan events ever staged, it started, modestly enough, with a run down the Shenandoah Valley with vintage 50s Southern FP7 diesels. Then steam took over, on a trip to Bluefield with the A, seen here at Elliston at the foot of the Christiansburg grade. The winding course of the Norfolk Western Main Line takes it along the New River Valley, the natural route between the Appalachian and Allegheny mountain ranges. After following the river downstream, the line swings west up the East River, climbing a ruling gradient of 1 in 100 to Bluefield. The train weight of 2,250 tons was made up of 25 passenger coaches, many of them privately owned and maintained specially for these occasions. Bluefield, West Virginia, is the center of commerce for the Pocahontas coal fields. At a height of 2,558 feet above sea level, it is the highest point on the Norfolk Western Main Line. Locomotives were changed here, as J-Class 484 number 611 was attached to the rear of the train to take it back to Roanoke. The descent of East River was taken very gently, as 611 eased the heavy train down the sharp curves. At the picturesque turn-of-the-century station of Christiansburg, there was some hint of the drama to come at the weekend, as 1218 stormed through with a 2,000-ton train of freight cars for Roanoke. Double the load to 4,000 tons, and you have some idea of how the A's performed in everyday service, on grades steeper than 1%. To say that the Norfolk and Western put on a grand show would be an understatement. At night, the J and the A were posed together on the turntable at Schaefer's and floodlit for the benefit of enthusiast cameras. But the finest spectacle of all was saved for the morning of August the 1st. The Class A was again put at the head of a freight, while the J on the convention special steamed alongside. A great double act of American superpower. After boarding the special again, passengers had a view of the Virginian Railway Bridge at Warburn before entering Shawsville Tunnel. Through the second bore of Montgomery Tunnel, the approaching headlight of the 1218 could be seen as passengers crowded the windows for a better view. The two Norfolk and Western showpieces then steamed majestically together up to Christiansburg Hill, truly an awe-inspiring sight. At least one rail fan thought he was dreaming it all. At Radford, the locals turned out to welcome their special visitor. .1218 left the freight to take her place in front of the J, double-heading the special back to Roanoke. On the last day of the convention, roles were reversed as the J piloted the A to Lynchburg. This was the first double-headed steam train on Blue Ridge for 28 years. The return trip was in the hands of 1218, the last event in a remarkable convention program that would be hard to beat in the future. We were privileged to ride in the cab for the climb back over Blue Ridge as the guest of veteran foreman Frank Collins, who actually drove the 1218 when she was new in 1943. Fireman on this section was Preston Claytor, son of retired company chairman Robert Claytor, a distinguished crew indeed. For the A, it had been just one busy weekend out of many. She was booked for at least another 14 trips for the rest of the 1987 season. On August the 4th, she returned the 50 hopper cars borrowed from Bluefield Yard, and at the same time had 15 passenger coaches to take to Ohio for further excursion service. This unadvertised trip turned out to be the hardest task of all. 3,250 tons on the 1.6 grade higher up the East River, a gradient of 1 in 62. The A was pushed to its design limit and passed the test with flying colours. Finally, a run down the main line through the towns of the West Virginia coalfield, the Norfolk and Western heartland, the very reason for its existence. While coal for the eastern seaboard is sent from Bluefield, Williamson is the collecting point for coal traffic to the industrial areas of the Great Lakes and the Midwest. This is where the 1218 spent most of her working life, steaming across the flatlands with 18,000-ton coal trains to Ohio and the north. 1218 had finally come home.